Hi, I'm Veronique with the Chronic Illness Trauma Studies. If you have a chronic illness, you may be, like myself, someone who has no history of trauma. And especially if you have an illness that's been difficult to diagnose, that's been invisible, that has no diagnostic test, like chronic fatigue, which is the chronic illness I have, you may have really been judged as someone who has an illness that's psychological. And that's a huge problem that we really need to change. And the science is showing that that's really not the case. In this video, I want to talk about what kinds of risk factors might exist if you don't have a history of trauma, based on what I've been finding in the research for the past 15 years. So one of the things that we know about trauma are the really big events. And the no history of trauma is really about the other end of the spectrum that looks at very subtle experiences and events that have happened that we have no recollection of because they happen very early in life. So if I draw chronic illness here as an asterisk and we go back in life, when we look for risk factors, we have to look really early. And one of them is in the perinatal time frame, and that is during pregnancy, birth, and infancy. And when I first was looking into research to understand more about what might be or might have triggered or initiated risk for my own chronic illness, I had trouble finding anything in chronic fatigue, in part because it's so difficult to diagnose, and in part because they haven't been looking very early. So I ended up looking at type 1 diabetes, and that's a chronic illness that no one would ever think was psychological, or at least it doesn't seem like anyone would ever think that. And what I found in the research was that the studies were noticing that people with type 1 diabetes have antibodies. Not everyone, but most people with many people with type 1 diabetes have antibodies. And what they've discovered in type 1 diabetes, lupus, and other chronic illnesses is that these antibodies often show up for years before the actual onset of the chronic illness, sometimes as much as 10 years or even more. And so what it made some of these researchers realize is that this must indicate that the risk factors for chronic illness begin way before the chronic illness itself. And so they started looking very early in life. And what they found in more than one chronic illness was that there are events that happen around birth. These can be really difficult events, and it can be events that have ended up making for a very complicated delivery, being born breech, having a very long, difficult labor. It could also be premature birth, and it may have to do with an illness in the mother that may have happened during the pregnancy or right around the time of labor, and that meant that they had to do a cesarean section. So any of those can be risk factors for many chronic illnesses, not just type 1 diabetes, but it turns out I've seen research for multiple sclerosis and asthma and other chronic illnesses as well. But I didn't have a history of any of these kinds of difficulties. My mom's pregnancy had been really normal. My birth had been as well. And I ended up continuing to look in the research, and I found a lot more information in some studies on asthma. And what the asthma studies were showing was that it's not just physical events that are difficult, like illness in the mom or in the baby around this very early time, but also very psychologically stressful events. And this doesn't end up meaning that it's a psychological issue. What I found when I pursued the research in asthma was that events that happen at this time frame affect the whole family. They affect the baby, but they also affect the parents. And in the interaction between baby and parents, it influences our genes. And this is because life experiences very early on influence how our genes function. And so risk factors here are actually one important series of events that can initiate risk for chronic illness. That's one place to look. And what I learned about asthma that ended up applying to other chronic illnesses also helped me understand more about what had looked so normal in my own very early experiences, but that very likely contributed to early risk. The other area that they have been looking at in chronic illness is even before that, and that's multi-generational trauma. So we're not going to have any memory of that having happened in our own lives. And often our parents haven't had any sense, or our grandparents, of anything that's been traumatic in their lives. And so the research has looked at really very extreme events to get a sense about what might happen. And what they found have come from research in World War II, which showed that women who experience a lot of stress during pregnancy have experiences that influence their babies. It may influence birth size, small babies, large babies, and it influences the child's health all the way into adulthood. But it also affects the health of these kids' children. And that research, they're now at least looking at 3 generations from what happened in World War II. They've also started research studies that are looking at what happened on 9/11 for women who were pregnant then. They've also looked at studies for women who were pregnant during really huge ice storms in Quebec that knocked out all the electricity and the power, where it was really cold, and essentially very stressful circumstances. So if you have no history of trauma, think on a different level and consider the possibility that there may have been some very subtle events early in life and even before you were born that may have affected your risk for chronic illness. One of the reasons that it can be really helpful to know about these kinds of events as risk factors for chronic illness is that even if we're an adult with chronic illness, there are actually ways of working to heal the effects, at least some of the effects of events, even if they've happened in our ancestors. And I will give you some links to tools that can help us work with that. The other is that, just to complete my word here, is that if you're a parent of a child with chronic illness, the studies that I found in asthma give a lot of tools for actually helping to work with the effects of events that may have happened in your own life as a parent, not because it's a blaming thing, but because events that happen to us have an impact on those we love as well. So on this blog, I've got a number of articles. I'm still writing about some of this information. It's an ongoing process as I create a more in-depth website by blogging about this on a regular basis. And I'll put some links to especially the articles I've started to write about this process of discovery and the research, the science that led me to understand a whole lot more about chronic illness than anything I'd ever understood or ever been told about when I was a doctor. And it continues to boil down to the fact that this is not psychological. So I'll put some resources down below, and I hope they're helpful for you. Until next time.